WICS and really TV as a whole here in
Right.
Central Illinois, celebrating just a huge milestone, 70 years on the air. Doug Quick is here with us. He's been with us professionally for many years, recently retired.
Right.
Congratulations.
Right. Thank you so much. It's been great.
I give you a big welcome back to the studio.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've been here. It's been at least maybe 2.5 years since I was here. I did the weather over here, so.
And now you got your website,
Yes.
dougquick.com. I would call you the premier TV historian in the state.
Probably so. I've looked at others, and I don't think there's anyone that has the detail that I have had.
Nothing quite as extensive.
It really started probably about 1997, 1998, and we were talking before. NBC had a thing, and we were an NBC affiliate here, and in Champaign, and they talked about branding. Branding was so important. I thought, well, I've been on the radio for a lot of years, and maybe I'd put a website just to, maintain my brand. And then I thought, well, what am I going to put on it? No one's going to just go to my website to see my face. It's got to have something with it. And it just so happened that early in my life, I used to stay with some grandparents. I grew up in Taylorville, and I stayed with my grandparents a lot. My parents were very young. My mother was 18 when she had me, and my dad was like, 21. So I stayed a lot with my grandparents. They were both working at the time, and they had a box of old TV guides. They didn't have much of anything else. They weren't necessarily hoarders, but they kept everything. But I went through these TV guides, and I read them over and over and over again, trying to find something that I may have missed along the way. And they went back to like 1953. So, and I still have those, by the way. But it had a lot of information about the local TV stations at that time. Now, later on, they kind of went away with that, but if you had the TV station, you sent them a press release, they'd print it. So, they always maintained the comings and goings of personnel and personalities and such. So that was a pretty good start. I thought, well, maybe I'll get into some TV history. So I put pictures up of some of the old station ads and that kind of thing. And it just kind of grew from there. And I just kept adding things. And then I'd hear from people, and they'd send me information. And I've made contacts with so many people in this business over the years that I used to watch on TV, and it was really cool, to meet a lot of these people, whether it was a weathercaster or that. And I mean, I've emailed Flip Spiceland. We back and forth. He was a weather guy here for a number of years. Gus, of course, I knew. Yep. But it was really neat to actually talk with a lot of these people. So, and being a Central Illinois guy, I just thought it was just kind of a natural thing. We'd include some, broadcast history. And I do radio and that kind of thing too. I did some of the radio stations that I had intimate knowledge of and had pictures and tapes and that kind of thing. So I included that on there. I've always been a broadcast automation freak. And I guess that started from the days that I worked at WTAX and WDVR back in 1976. And worked with a lot of people there that were just kings of broadcast. Yeah. Working for Shelby Harbison, one of the best owners, operators that I've ever experienced. He was a terrific guy. And I used to meet with him about once every couple of months or so. We'd meet in Decatur with a couple other guys, and we'd always, rehash the past and stuff and talk about the future. And so I got to know a lot of great people over the years. Again, people that I grew up watching on TV.
It must have been a very cool experience.
Oh, it's been great. And I've heard from some of the people, some of their relatives, their kids and grandkids over the years, and they've sent me stuff. They've sent me, I don't like to collect real things, but
copies,
but pictures and things like that. I don't want to have a TV camera sitting in my
that'll take up space
too. Yeah, exactly, a lot of space. So just send me a picture of it. Right. That's good enough.
Yeah, and you can store it on the website. Hey, 85,000 people have already gone over. At least that's what you have on the counter.
Yeah,
but
that's on the
really
counter.
More,
yeah,
right?
It's actually more. I redid the website a few years ago with some new software, and it's worked out quite well. It's given me a lot of flexibility and to put things where I want and so on. I started learning HTML, and my head about exploded. So
well, it's not an easy thing.
I'm a little old to do that. So So I use the software, and it's been great. I keep adding things to it all the time, refining things, rearranging things. So and people still send me information. One thing that people always want to know: my parents danced on the hop. Can I say Channel 3? My parents danced on the hop at Channel 3. Do you have any recordings of them? The answer is no. They do not exist.
That's not happening.
There was one here at 20 that they did at the Leland Hotel in the ballroom.
Right.
It was called the Pepsi Party Time. And I don't have any recordings of those either.
I'm sure you don't.
And I doubt if even 20 has any.
We'd have to look real deep in the storage.
In those days, it was live. It was live, and it was a puff of air. And when it escaped the antenna, it was done.
Gone.
That was it.
Exactly.
So it was very expensive to record. There wasn't videotape really until, as far as local stations, until the very early '60s. There was kinescopes, but nobody had any kinescope apparatus except for Channel 3. They did, and they have maintained a pretty good library of kinescopes. And those are films made from TV screens. It's a little more complex than that, but that's essentially what it is.
Right.
And most of them look like garbage. I mean, they're not very good, but that's what we had. But yeah, there's very little of that stuff. There's a lot of stuff that shows up on YouTube, a lot of old TV shows and that kind of thing, and those are actually kinescopes for the most part, until you get into at least the '60s, and then somebody's got some videotape access. But
right.
For the most part, all that stuff's gone. So we have to rely on still pictures.
Exactly.
And when I was researching for my book, I had a lot of help from a lot of people. I'll say right now, the Illinois Journal-Register was no help at all. But they fortunately gave a lot of their photo files to the Lincoln Public Library, so I had access through them. But that's the only way that I had the 20s. Plus, coming here, and I copied a lot of pictures and stuff that were available here in a very small archive, so there wasn't a whole lot of information.
Oh, sure. And I mean, there's such a rich history of television in Central Illinois, and just to get just a tiny taste of it off of these pictures is really something. But what I'd like is for someone maybe watching this, someone who is interested, maybe like you were reading the TV programs back in the day and the history of television, especially specifically here in Central Illinois. Do you have like an abridged timeline of because this is 70 years now.
Right,
1953
right.
Was when we went on air, WICS, but also in Central Illinois. Going from
TV
there,
blossomed.
53 on,
Right.
It really is.
Yeah, it really started in 1948 when the FCC halted the issuing of all licenses. It was called a freeze, and they were trying to come out with some broadcast standards for the TV stations of the future. Channels 2 through 13 wasn't going to cut it. There were too many stations, and they were too powerful. They had excessive range, and you couldn't squeeze all of the all the TV stations they were expecting in 2 through 13. So they added the UHF band. Okay, that's fine and dandy, but the UHF band has a certain amount of limitations that the VHF stations didn't. VHF stations had ranges of up to 80 miles. If they were full power, they were up to 80 miles with 100. Usually 100 kW for the lower end VHF stations. But the UHF stations could broadcast 20,000 watts and maybe get out 20 miles. And so there was a lot of limitations. Now by the end of the whole analog TV, there were transmitters out there pumping out 5 million watts, and they were getting 60 to 80 miles pretty easy.
That's the unique thing about our market, specifically here in Central Illinois, comparatively to other markets around the country, is that
we're mixed.
3, 4, 5 major cities that broadcast signals can go out to. Could you explain the difference really between the UHF and the VHF and how that all came to fruition? So it's not just Springfield, it's also Decatur, and it's Champaign, and Danville, and Effingham.
Right. Well, we were talking a little earlier about the Channel 2 situation. Springfield was actually issued a Channel 2, and all of the local radio stations tried to get it. WMAY had the lead for a long time. They actually hired a manager. His name was Lee Ruwich from Miami, and he managed one of the heritage stations there in Miami. He would have been a terrific broadcaster because he was in Florida. He was very, very active. They hired him, they hired an entire staff. The FCC said, well, we favor you. And then later they actually issued a construction permit, but there was one catch. They couldn't build anything.
Right.
And Channel 2 was originally going to be located where Hardee's is on Stevenson Drive.
Oh, yeah.
And that was their original site, which WMAY eventually moved their radio studios there for a while, and then they moved back to Spalding. But Channel 20 did not want Channel 2 here, and the reason why is because they would have taken NBC right out from underneath them.
Oh, yeah.
Channel 20 had a month-by-month affiliation agreement with NBC. Normally they go like 6 or 7 years, and this was a month-by-month because they were expecting Channel 2 to come on the air.
Sure.
And when that occurred, 20 would have been dead. And that's one reason why they stayed at the Leland Hotel. They had their transmitter and tower on top of WCVS's AM station in Southern View, which that tower is still there. And WFMB is there, and their antenna is now on top.
Yeah.
They actually had an FM station there earlier. It was WCVS FM. It was at 102.9. They moved it to Decatur, and that became WSOY FM, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
And now both of those stations are actually co-owned by the same company. So it's ironic that things happen like that. But over the years, they were fighting, Channel 20 especially, Plains Television Partners fought Channel 3 tooth and nail because they wanted to take that Channel 3 VHF station away from CIA and send it to the UHF band. That would have equalized the playing field across central Illinois.
Right, because
as it was,
20
3 was kicking everybody's rear because they had the ad money because they were going to reach a large number of households.
Right.
And especially out in the rural areas.
So when did it change? When did eventually Channel 2 get kicked to St. Louis? Channel
It was in
20
1957, but it was supposed to be temporary. Right, it was temporary.
Nothing will ever go the way it's supposed to be, right?
No,
in television.
But the guy that was lobbying for Channel 2 to be in St. Louis, his name was Harry Tenenbaum. The guy was incredible. He would send Christmas turkeys to the FCC commissioners.
Oh, man.
He would send Thanksgiving turkeys to them. He would issue their secretaries. He would give them nylon stockings. I mean, which was totally illegal.
Of course.
He was lobbying the FCC to get Channel 2 in St. Louis. The guy was crazy. I mean, he was focused on getting it. Well, he ended up with it. I don't think that had anything to do with it, maybe in the long run.
This was 57?
This would have been in 57. But it wasn't really until about 63 or 64 that it was actually finally said, okay, that's it. And it actually went before the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court threw it back down to the appellate court and said, you guys figure it out.
And so how did that affect WICS? Once it was out of town, Channel 2 was in St. Louis.
Once it was out of town, they started making investments in the facility here. They built a new tower at Mechanicsburg. It was a 1,000-foot tower, which has since been replaced. And they built this studio here on East Cook Street in the early mid-60s.
Right.
So it was completed, and they drove cars in here for commercials, and I mean they had a huge studio compared to what they had at the Leland Hotel.
Yeah, the construction was really a big deal for the studio. I mean, downtown, the Leland Hotel, was that not even anything comparable to what we have here on Cook Street?
No, not at all. It was actually called the Leland Hotel Annex. It was a structure that was kind of built on the side of the hotel along Capitol. I think the church that is there, they tore it down and they built their campus, kind of took that spot right off the alley. But yeah, that was all, and that was where WCVS radio was originally located. When the TV station in there, they obviously had a deal going here. In fact, one of the managers here had written, before he retired, I think, Jerry Merritt, had written a description of everything in the history of WICS. And that helped me a lot. I mean,
sure.
he was giving, model numbers for transmitters and things like that, which was interesting. I mean, if you're into that thing, and
maybe for you, it
was I mean, it
right?
was very interesting. But he described everything pretty much to a T, and he didn't come right out and say, well, there was an agreement between the CVS and WICS, but there obviously was because they were paying rent. for that. But they weren't going to make any kind of a major investment. In fact, they put this station on the air for less than, I think, $230,000.
Wow.
Which that may be a little high, but a lot of stations were going in the air with 350,000, 450,000, and there were some that tried to get on the air for less than 125.
Yeah.
But we don't see them. We don't see WBLN in Bloomington. We don't see a lot of those stations anymore. So
the first broadcast on WICS, if I'm not mistaken, was a pregame show for the World Series.
Yes, and Bernie Waterman did it. Bernie Waterman passed away in the 90s, not that long ago. Really, of course, the older you are, you can say that. But he actually owned some TV stations in Florida. He did very well for himself. Yeah, he did very well for himself.
And so after that inception, after the World Series in '53,
Yeah. It was the Yankees and the Brooklyn Dodgers, by the way.
There you go.
I have no idea who won. I don't really care.
Somebody Google it real quick.
Yeah, somebody will find that.
I'm sure. It's a 2-second. That's what's so interesting about the difference between then and now is you had to tune into TV to understand and to know what was going on in the world.
You got to realize not many people had TV back in those days. I mean, I went to grade school with kids that didn't have TVs.
It was a radio.
My dad and his brother used to fix TVs.
Sure.
It was kind of a side hustle, and because they worked at Staley's in Decatur, but it was kind of a side hustle. They repaired used TVs and sold them.
Nice.
I had a TV in my bedroom when I was in kindergarten. I mean, there were kids that didn't even have a TV in their house.
It was a big luxury.
Oh, I mean, it was great.
Yeah. After the World Series in '53.
So I blame them for all this.
Right. That's it. Come on. Seriously.
Yeah. Be careful what you expose your children to.
Right. There's the moral of the story.
That's it.
So moving forward from '53, it was September 30th. Was the original date here on WICS. And into the future, they're at the Leland Hotel. Then we're here in '64. Once we're here in this studio, I was saying when we walked into the room, it is interesting because I have never really thought of it like this, in that the history of this room that we are in, that I'm in every day, is very rich, and a lot of programming came through here, a lot of shows. You were talking about the cars being driven in and out.
Right.
What sort of shows took place in here? And
well, the kids shows
who was
were
in
the
here
big
as
thing.
well?
The kids shows were the big thing.
Yeah.
I think most local stations had them. Were they a lot of trouble? You bet they were, and they had to hire people for it, but they had sponsors for it.
Right.
We mentioned Pigwell Pete earlier. Bill Weingartner. He was Pigwell Pete for from the mid '50s all the way through at least the mid '60s, and he'd make appearances at the state fair, and he was all over the place, and kids loved that show. And they'd show the Warner Brothers cartoons, and they'd play some games and that kind of thing. But everybody loved Pigwell Pete, and we mentioned Clickety Clack and Bill Miller. That was a huge kid show, and they would have a Christmas show all the time where the employees would bring their kids and that kind of thing, and there'd be 80 kids in here. I couldn't imagine doing live TV in front of 80 screaming kids. You
had to have a couple of supervisors in there to try to make that
There might have been a lot of drinking going on back in the control room, but it would have been really a hazard. But they did it. And I don't think a broadcaster, and the thing was that those kids being in here grew up to be adults eventually, and they had a link to this TV station.
Oh yeah.
That brought future viewers to Channel 20. And I think local broadcasters are lazy now. They don't want to do it. They just expect them to be there. Well, you got to work at it. You got to promote. And when I was in promotions, we did appearances at the county fairs. We did everything, and sometimes it was tough to get an anchor to agree to go out and do a smelly, hot, humid county fair. But it's valuable, and it's important that we do that. We got to make links with the viewing public, and that's the easy way to do it. At least it appears easy. It's not,
right?
But it does, and it really works. And for all those kids that were in here. Over the years, there might have been only a half a dozen at a time, but every day those kids looked and go, gee, that's where I was, you know? And it's important that we continue to do that. And unfortunately, none do it now. And it's sad. It's just a passing era.
Well, so when those kids eventually grew up to be adult news viewers or television viewers as a whole, the golden age of television here at WICS came a little bit after its inception, especially for the news, on the news side.
Sure.
We were talking about Don
News
Hickman
became a little more serious. I mean, it was always serious before.
Right.
But it became a little more serious. You know, when I was growing up, Channel 20 kind of had the reputation that if it didn't happen in the city limits, it didn't happen. And I think, but everything was about the state capitol. You know, it's like, well, I don't live at the state capitol. I don't need to, you know. But it was important that being in the capitol, being in the state capitol, you had a responsibility to do that. And they did, you know, they didn't have live shots. They didn't, you know, I'm just not a big believer that that's always the thing that you should do.
Right.
Sometimes, yes, if you have a reason. But just to go out and stand in front of the Capitol and do a thing, you know, it's kind of worthless. But I mean, that's my opinion. And I know there's a lot of news directors that would disagree with me over time.
Oh, I'm sure.
But in this day and age, it's dangerous. You know, it can be dangerous.
Yeah, television has
We've seen
evolved
that.
so much. It's evolved from you know, photojournalists to multimedia journalists and the one-man band and everything like that.
Yeah.
And we've seen the whole evolution of TV here from 70 years ago, 53, to now. We're in 2023, and it's been it's been quite the ride to get there. Is there maybe anything as we wrap up here, last couple of minutes, anything that you think is worth mentioning, such that rich history here? In
Yeah,
the station?
I think every TV station in this market has a story. Some were backed by the newspaper. The original Channel 15 in Champaign actually began in Danville when it was WDAN TV. It was backed by the Commercial News, which was a Gannett paper at the time. That was their second TV station that they owned. That later sold to Plains Television. But Channel 3 had newspaper and a local radio station back it. A&D really they didn't have any connection to the local media. 20, they were not viewed friendly when they came in because they weren't local. They weren't local people. They were all out of town. And that was used against them in some arguments too for issuing Channel 2, because these were all local groups that were applying for that. But there was, you know, the thing is, there was no rule book. There was no guide. Oh, gee, I got a problem. I could look it up. It didn't exist.
Yeah, they were
And everybody did their own thing. Did they make mistakes? You betcha. There was a lot of
sure.
mistakes. But you know, this is still here. And some of the oldest businesses in the community is the radio and TV stations.
Yeah.
You know, and the newspaper as well, we're watching that kind of crumble too. But the TV stations will be here for a while anyway, hopefully.
Well, we hope so as well. And of course, we are so glad to have you in the studio. One last time, real quick, before we sign off. Your book, how can people get it?
My book is out of print right now. I'm in the process of putting together an ebook, and hopefully I'll have it at some time this spring.
The growing evolution of
Yes,
media.
and because there's a lot of new things in there that I will be adding, a lot of pictures and so on and so forth. But my website is there. It's free.
Yep.
You don't have to sign in. It's Central Illinois' online broadcast museum.
There we go.
And it's
DougQuick.com.
DougQuick.com.
Fantastic. Doug, thanks for hanging out in the
Thank
studio.
you.
Appreciate it.